Hello, good evening. I'm Hoshang Merchant. Thank you for coming to the lecture today. The Whabiz Merchant Lecture Series was started in my sister's memory in 2012 with the money she left me. This is the 5th edition. So far, Homi Bhabha, Akhil Bilgrami, David Davidine, David Schulman have spoken on topics of their expertise. I promise that the next 5 speakers will be women. Today, Dr. Zareer Masani, noted historian and BBC broadcaster, speaks on the British contribution to India, especially Mountstuart Elphinston's role in establishing English education in India. I will remember Whabiz by reading a poem that I've written to her, but let me introduce my sister to you before that. Whabiz Merchant studied for a PhD in anthropology at Chicago University and taught sociology at minority colleges in the Midwest and Far West of the United States for 22 years. She was a beloved teacher, researcher, homemaker, gourmet cook, an avid gardener who loved children and her pet cats. She traveled in Europe every summer. She is the author of Home on the Hill, an autobiography, and Journey to El Norte about Mexico. She fell ill at 47. Most of her money went to charity. I have established this series from the money that she left me. My sister takes a long, long time to die. It was the dark of winter when the illness came like a thunderclap. They isolated an Indian girl in the Chicago snow, hoping this Indian disease would go away. But it was America that had killed her. The sickness in us is named America, and the long, long time of waiting does not go away. She had waited long in the dark of her Lord, the Lord she called Father, who never had a kind word, the Lord who giveth and taketh away, and now is the time of taking away. The man she called Lord and man's servant, the lover with fair hair and blue eyes, who ferries her hither and thither like Sharon. My sister, she hangs by a slender thread that cannot snap, because the long, long time of waiting is never dead. And she called Death her brother, brilliant, charismatic Death. Death who loves and beguiles and kills, but does not beget. Death the brother who no sister in life can wed. That unfulfilled love, that great longing that does not die, for that long, long time of waiting never dies. And now in the brilliance of summer, of melting light and butterfly, she floats between dark and light, as on a river a swan doubly glides, one half flesh, one half shadow, sister and brother, reality and reflection on the same river. She has crossed life's flood on a reed. She awaits a boat now to ferry her to the other shore, and the long, long wait she waits for all of us will never die. Thank you.
Friends, it's hard to follow that poem with something as mundane as educational legacies of the Raj, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Before I do, I just want to issue some thanks. Firstly, to Hoshang for inviting me to do this talk. Secondly, to Khushru Santuk for making the theatre available to us and for kindly coming, even though I know he has another engagement. And also to thank Faranaz Irani, who has made so many of the arrangements, and her assistant Zenobia. So to all of you and everyone else at the NCPA who's put in some work on this, thank you very much indeed. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to begin with an anecdote about Mahatma Gandhi and a very eminent British educationist called Sir Philip Hartog. whose image you can see here. And if you're wondering why he was there when Ho Sheng was talking, that's him. Philip Hartog was in India for many years as an education advisor. He was Vice Chancellor of Dhaka University, and he founded SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He met Gandhi at Chatham House in 1931 when Gandhi was giving a lecture when he was there for the Round Table Conference on India's constitutional future. And he gave this lecture, which was a very scathing attack on the Raj. And he said, today India is more illiterate than it was 50 or 100 years ago, because the British, instead of taking hold of things as they were, began to root them out. They scratched the soil and began to look at the root and left the root like that, and the beautiful tree perished. Now, Hartog was rather surprised by Gandhi's claim about the damage the British had done, about literacy in particular. So he wrote to Gandhi, pointing out that according to official census figures, male literacy in British India had steadily, if not spectacularly, increased from 8% in 1881 to 14.4% in 1921. The two men exchanged letters and met to discuss their differences. Gandhi cited the near universal prevalence of village schools in pre-colonial India, whereas Hartog pointed out that the number of schools mattered far less than what happened in those schools, and that very little literacy was actually being produced in these village schools because people dropped out much before they became literate. He then urged the Mahatma, in keeping with his commitment to truth, to take back his allegation and publicly withdraw his claims, mistaken claims, about Indian literacy having declined. Gandhi obfuscated. He was now back in India, busy with civil disobedience. He said he was too busy to research his own claims. But, he wrote, my prejudice or presentiment still makes me cling to the statement I made at Chatham House. Now, the correspondence ended there, but the argument about this so-called beautiful tree of Indian knowledge that the British uprooted goes on. Today, I'd like to go beyond the prejudices to which Gandhi confessed. Now, for a younger generation today, empire is automatically evil. Empire is an evil word. Anything empires did was awful. People forget that empires were the default mode of governance till 2 centuries ago. So the idea that imperialism could be a benevolent modernizing force comes as a major surprise to many. It's deeply unfashionable. But I'd like to give you a few examples of how, far from wanting to plunder India's cultural riches or colonize our minds, most founders of British rule were fascinated and incredibly curious about India's traditional arts, crafts, culture, keen to explore the wonders of its classical past. Now, I'm going to begin with Warren Hastings, who was the first Governor General. He's pictured here with his wife and ayah. Hastings mixed freely with Indians. He was fluent in 2 Indian languages, Hindustani and Bengali. He spoke some Persian. He studied Sanskrit. He was incredibly keen on translating the Sanskrit classics. He, in fact, I think one has to say that it was Warren Hastings, not Siraj-ud-Dowla, whom the British overthrew, the Nawab whom the British overthrew, who began India's national cultural renaissance. Its nucleus was the Asiatic Society of Calcutta, founded in 1784. Now, I've got a slide of it somewhere, if I can find it, because it's a rather beautiful. Yeah, that's the building as it is now. At its head was one of the great polymaths of the European Enlightenment, a man called Sir William Jones. Now I'm going to try and show you what he looked like. That's him. He was an Orientalist, a philologist, and a jurist. Hastings brought him in as a judge in Calcutta's new Supreme Court. He was busy codifying and translating India's traditional laws and customs, but he found time to rediscover India's cultural heritage. He and Hastings together set up the Asiatic Society, which brought the print revolution to India. It published a Bengali grammar, which was the first work in any Indian language to be printed. And it began a flow of journals dictated to the study of India's classical Hindu and Buddhist past. The Governor-General himself, as was an eager patron of Sanskrit, and the Orientalists opened up the Sanskrit classics to both Europeans and other Indians by translating and printing them in English and the Indian vernaculars. Hastings personally funded a translation of the Bhagavad Gita, wrote an enthusiastic introduction to it. Now, the early Indian Orientalists, rather the British Orientalists in India, had to do without the aid of past historians because ancient India, unlike ancient Greece and Rome, didn't leave behind written histories of its own. India's past had to be reconstructed from ancient stones and ruins, from lost pavilions and buried treasure. What the Asiatic Society did do was to mobilize an enthusiastic volunteer army of amateur archaeologists from among all the British civil and military officers who were stationed in the districts. They were officially encouraged to spend their leisure time exploring local monuments, collecting their artifacts, and publishing learned findings in the Society's journals. It was their efforts that led to the excavation and conservation of some of our most iconic sites, Elephanta and Ajanta, Amravati and Ellora, Khajuraho and Mahabalipuram. British Orientalists were responsible for two dramatic chronological breakthroughs in their rediscovery of India's classical past. The first was by Sir William Jones himself. Having mastered Sanskrit, he managed to identify Chandragupta Maurya as the 4th century BC Indian king who received the Greek historian come diplomat Megasthenes. It was a discovery which enabled the timeline of Indian history to be dated back to the Buddha. Half a century later, another outstanding British polymath, James Prinsep, whom I'm going to picture if I can. Yes, there he is. Took this one step further by deciphering the forgotten Brahmi script, thereby revealing the edicts carved into bronze pillars by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. As secretary of the Asiatic Society, Prinsep was a prime example of the brilliant amateurism of British Orientalists. He wasn't a historian, but a numismatist, and he worked in the East India Company's mint at Benares, and yet his work deciphering coin inscriptions led him to the greatest discovery to date in Indian historiography, namely Ashoka. Today, we take Ashoka for granted as the symbol of our national unity in the ancient past, but few Indian nationalists give credit to a British official for having given them that memory. Instead, the nationalist narrative accuses Western Orientalists of using their scholarly pursuits as yet another form of colonial appropriation, documenting India in order to rule it more effectively. An important element of this theory of cultural imperialism was, of course, the notion put forward by Gandhi at Chatham House that Western rulers had systematically uprooted traditional Indian education and replaced it with a Western system designed to colonize the minds of Indians. This, I would argue, is a theory based on emotions rather than evidence, and I intend to join good old Sir Philip Hartog in challenging that today. Now, let's start by considering the state of Indian education before the East India Company took over. It's a sad fact that the only surviving reports about Indian education before and during the early Raj come from foreign observers. In fact, the only eyewitness account of pre-colonial academic life in India is from the intrepid 17th century French traveler François Bernier. I'm going to try and show you what he looked like. There he is. Here is the cover page of the book he wrote on his travels in India, a description of the states under the Grand Mughal. Now, Bernier spent 8 years in India. He was physician to the Mughal Crown Prince Dara Shikoh, and then he stayed on at the court of Aurangzeb, who had killed and usurped Dara Shikoh. He wrote home about Mughal India, "The country is ruined by the necessity of defraying the enormous charges required to maintain the splendor of a numerous court and to pay a large army maintained for the purpose of keeping the people in subjection. No adequate idea can be conveyed of the sufferings of that people. The cudgel and the whip compel them to incessant labor for the benefit of others." And he was writing about Mughal India, not about British India. Bernier was equally scathing about the Hindu holy city of Benares, then regarded as the Athens of India. He said there was nothing there approaching a decent university, neither colleges nor classes, just small groups of disciples under religious gurus housed in the homes of rich merchants. The students, he said, were generally indolent. Their studies might drag on for more than a decade with an antiquated curriculum based on Sanskrit and the study of holy texts. When it came to philosophy, Bernier condemned what he called the extreme ignorance of the teachers who make 1,000 foolish and confused observations. He was even more scornful of Hindu astronomy and geography. Students, he said, were taught that the world is flat and triangular, divided up into 7 continents surrounded by seas of milk, butter, sugar, and wine, the whole supported on the heads of a number of elephants, whose occasional motion is the cause of earthquakes. He also went on to say there was no understanding of anatomy because caste taboos forbade dissection, but the gurus, he sneered, quote, affirmed that the number of veins in the human body is 5,000, neither more nor less, just as if they had carefully reckoned them. Bernier's account, however exaggerated, is a stark reminder of how far pre-colonial Indian education had fallen behind its European contemporaries. So, I mean, don't forget, this was the age of Descartes and Newton in Europe. Especially, India had fallen far behind in the science and technology that would prove so decisive in the next 2 centuries. Early modern India had nothing resembling a secular higher education system, no self-governing colleges and universities of the sort that had been flowering in Europe since the late medieval period. Europe, of course, owed its preeminence to the rise of an urban middle class from the Renaissance and Reformation onwards. India didn't get an urban middle class till well into the British colonial period. The Indian picture was even more depressing when it came to primary education. Now, this is contentious because British officials in the 1820s and 1830s produced figures which some nationalist historians have put forward, showing that before the British uprooted the so-called beautiful tree, every village in Bengal, Madras, and Bombay had a school with pupil attendance rates actually higher than in contemporary England. But what such statistics disguised was the very primitive schooling on offer in most Indian village schools. The absence of printed books, the withdrawal of children before they reached the level of literacy, the absence of any exams. In the 1780s, about a century after Bernier, another foreign visitor, an Austrian priest called Father Bartolomeo, spent 13 years in India. He was dismayed by schooling standards in the prosperous region of Malabar. He wrote, "Children assemble half naked under the shade of a coconut tree. No people on earth have adhered so much to their ancient usages and customs as the Indians," and he didn't mean that as a compliment. There were no books, backboards, or even slates, he wrote. People traced letters in the sand, prostrated themselves before their teachers, and never questioned their authority. According to the Delhi-based education historian Aparna Basu, the decline in Indian educational standards dated back at least to the mid-1700s, after the decline of the Mughal Empire, but well before the British took over. She writes, "The village pathshalas were often housed in shabby dwellings and taught by ill-qualified teachers. There was no fixed class routine, timetable, or school calendar. There was no annual examination." So now it was against this background that in 1813 the British Parliament enacted a very modest provision of 1 lakh of rupees annually, which is about 50 lakhs in today's money, quote, for the revival and improvement of literature and encouragement of the learned natives of India, and for the introduction and promotion of a knowledge of the sciences. 20 years later, the amount was increased to 10 lakhs, 5 crores in today's money, obviously still a drop in the ocean, but still well in advance of England, which at that time and until quite a bit later had no public funds at all for education. In England and most of Europe and the world then was governed by laissez-faire government, which did not believe in providing public services. So this state funding from the British Raj went initially to Calcutta's Sanskrit College and its Muslim madrasa, which were both committed to traditional learning. But there also followed a rapid expansion of the voluntary sector with the so-called convent schools, which we're all familiar with, opened by Christian missionaries. They wrote, translated, and printed the first school textbooks in Indian languages and introduced modern schooling with timetables, grades, classes, and teachers specializing in different subjects. In 1816, this educational groundswell produced the Calcutta Hindu College. Now, I'll just show it to you because it's a rather beautiful building. Oops, jumped. Yeah, there we are. Contrary to what its name suggests, the Calcutta Hindu College was India's first Western-style secular college. It was founded as a private joint venture between committed British officials and the new Western-oriented Bengali elite, led by the great reformer Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And I have a nice picture of him here, a statue of him, erected in Bristol, at Bristol University, where he settled in the 1830s and ended his days. Now, Calcutta Hindu College was later renamed Presidency College, and its secular modernism made it a model for future Indian colleges. Colonial Calcutta also led the way with a new school book society, which printed 126,000 free school books in its first 4 years, and an allied school society which opened 115 new vernacular schools, not English medium, during the same period. Back in London, the East India Company's directors were getting alarmed. They were there for trade, and they thought that the spread of Western education in India might encourage a spirit of rebellion among their new Indian subjects. So not exactly a desire to colonize Indian minds, rather to make money. But the new Governor-General, Lord Hastings, who was no relation to Warren, replied, "It would be treason to British sentiment to imagine that it could ever be the principle of this government to perpetuate ignorance in order to secure paltry and dishonest advantages over the blindness of the multitude." His illustrious deputy in Bombay, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, whom I'm going to show you here in a statue. Yes, there we. This is a statue erected to him in St. Paul's Cathedral, where he was buried. Elphinstone went further than Hastings in proclaiming education as the stepping stone to India's independence and Britain's high road back to Europe. The Raj, he argued, must sow the seeds of its own dissolution. It is for our interest, Elphinstone wrote, to have an early separation from a civilized people rather than a violent rupture with a barbarous nation. Under his leadership, the Bombay Native Education Society published thousands of new school textbooks, many in local languages like Marathi. It opened several new schools, started classes in medicine and engineering, and founded the prestigious Elphinstone College, which in turn produced graduates like me and my old friend Whabiz Merchant, and incidentally, my father and grandfather too. Now, Elphinstone lived and was here in the 1820s, and the idealism of people like him coincided with a new strand of British utilitarian thinking, which saw Western education as a necessary tool for recruiting India's middle class into the colonial administration. The result was an education policy that's still identified with the brilliant historian politician Thomas Macaulay, whose biography I recently wrote. Now, I'm going to show you Macaulay, looking as pugnacious as ever. He was education supremo to the reforming Governor-General William Bentinck, who is here looking rather more gentle. Macaulay transferred state funding from the study of classical Sanskrit and Arabic, not from Indian vernacular languages, from classical Sanskrit and Arabic, to English medium education in what he considered useful modern subjects. As we know, Macaulay's children is a derisive term that's still used to brand anglicized Indians like me as imperialist lackeys. But Macaulay has been much misunderstood and misquoted. His famous Education Minute of 1835 spoke of the need to create, quote, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. It's a line that's become a cliche, but those who quote it never quote Macaulay's next, far more egalitarian sentence. Quote, to that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for carrying knowledge to the great mass of the population. For a century that followed, British rule in India was constrained partly by lack of funds, partly by the prevailing laissez-faire philosophy of government, and it struggled to meet Macaulay's twin educational goals, which was first to create a class of westernized intermediaries, and then encourage them to filter down modern scientific knowledge through the vernaculars. Several governor-generals, Bentinck, Auckland, and Dalhousie, and I've got Dalhousie here. Poor Dalhousie was unfairly blamed for causing the mutiny. In fact, he ran a very enlightened administration with many important reforms. They all championed policies of comprehensive primary education based on vernacular schools. Unfortunately, they failed to implement them for lack of funds. After the British Crown took over from the company, after the mutiny, Viceroy Lord Mayo again took up the cudgel for vernacular education in 1868, and he attacked the so-called filtration theory, whereby knowledge would trickle down from the upper classes to the masses. He lamented, quote, in Bengal, we are educating in English a few hundred babus at great expense to the state. Many of them are well able to pay for themselves and have no other object in learning than to qualify for government employ. In the meanwhile, we have done nothing towards extending knowledge to the millions. Sorry. The babus will never do it. The more education you give them, the more they will try to keep it to themselves and make their increased knowledge a means of tyranny. Let the babus learn English by all means, but let us try to do something towards teaching the 3 R's to rural Bengal. In 1882, another Liberal Viceroy, Lord Ripon, whom I think I also have an image of, appointed a commission to inquire into what he called the present state of elementary education and the means by which this can be everywhere extended and improved. So when it came to the Raj spreading vernacular primary education among the masses, contrary to popular belief, at least the spirit was willing, even though the flesh was weak. Higher education for the Indian elites did fare much better under Macaulay's reforms. Even at the height of the mutiny of 1857, Governor-General Canning bravely went ahead with his plans to establish India's first modern universities at Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Here is Canning. He was called Clemency Canning for having avoided reprisals against mutinous sepoys, and here he's seen, I think, in Punch magazine, patting a mutinous sepoy on the head. So, thanks to Clemency Canning, we have Bombay University. Other cities followed suit, and the numbers of new colleges and college students multiplied rapidly. egged on by a wave of philanthropic endowments by Indian princes and newly enriched Indian business magnates. By 1890, in the course of 3 decades, the number of Indians in higher education had risen to 60,000, mainly in the liberal arts and law. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, conservatives like Viceroy Lord Curzon were alarmed that Indian universities, far from producing Macaulay children, were becoming a cradle for militant nationalists, socialists, and even violent terrorists, all of whom were being nurtured on Western political ideals. Now, here is Curzon in full viceregal regalia, which he loved wearing. Curzon reformed a lot of things while he was here, and Indian education was one of them. He decided Indian education was ripe for another major overhaul after Macaulay. In 1901, he convened what came to be known as the Simla Conference, to which he summoned the entire education establishment of the Raj, including vice-chancellors of major universities. Curzon himself chaired all its sessions for 6 hours a day for 16 grueling days. That was a measure of his commitment to the project. And he personally drafted all 150 resolutions that were passed. His opening speech to the conference was a scathing critique of universities for what he called too slavish imitation of English models, while offering few British-style collegiate benefits. He pointed out that Indian universities were little more than examination bodies, since they did hardly any teaching, and most private colleges affiliated to them had very poor standards. He went on to deliver a scathing critique of the way Macaulay's policies had been implemented. He said, "We thought that we could provide India with all that it required in the shape of university education by simply copying London University. Then we opined that it was enough to teach English to Indian children before they had even mastered their native tongues. Further, we assumed that because certain subjects were communicated in certain formulae and a recognized terminology to English boys, these would be equally intelligible to Indians. Finally, by making education the sole avenue to employment in the service of the state, we unconsciously made examination the sole test of education. Cramming," he declared, "which is their inevitable corollary, is now generally recognized as a universal danger. But in India, we appear to have pushed the method to an excess greater than I have come across in any country, with the exception of China." That still rings true. "It is of no use," he said, "to turn out respectable clerks or munsifs or vakils if this is done at the expense of the intellect of the nation. A people cannot rise in the scale of intelligence by the cultivation of memory alone." These are words that clearly have a resonance for our university system a century later. Now, Curzon saw the Oxbridge system as ideal, but he recognized that it could not be created overnight in India. He strongly criticized the senates of Indian universities for being packed with non-academics as a form of government patronage. Curzon declared it scandalous that less than 1/5 of the total boys of school-going age were then in primary education. Remarkably for such a staunch Tory, Curzon also took up cudgels on behalf of female education. He described the lack of female education as, quote, "the most conspicuous blot on the educational system of India. Only 1 girl attends for every 10 of the male sex, and only 2% of the female population of school-going age. And the total expenditure upon female education in primary and secondary schools from all public funds was last year only 11 lakhs, as compared with 80 lakhs on boys." He lamented the low expectations among Indian parents of women's role and the preference of the Indian upper classes to educate their girls within the zanana. Many of us are aware of Curzon's enormous contribution in restoring and conserving our ancient temples and mosques, but few people remember his commitment to education. So what were the practical results of all his rhetoric? Ironically, Curzon's critique of universities provoked believe it or not, a wave of protests by Indian graduates, accusing him of wanting to roll back Western education simply because it was encouraging liberal opposition to the government. The Congress leader G.K. Gokhale led the charge in the Imperial Legislative Council. He said, "The greatest work of Western education in the present state of India is not so much the encouragement of learning as the liberation of the Indian mind from the thraldom of old world ideas and the assimilation of all that is highest and best in the thought and life and character of the West. Englishmen," he said, "should have more faith in the influence of their history and their literature." Macaulay might have used exactly the same words as Gokhale. Curzon's reforms of the governing bodies of universities and colleges to make them more academically rigorous was opposed in the imperial legislature by most of its elected Indian members, led by Gokhale, who called it, quote, "an emphatic condemnation, as unmerited as it was unnecessary, of the educated classes of this country." So clearly vested interest there. The reforms were implemented nonetheless, and it was later agreed that far from undermining India's educated elite, they greatly improved academic standards. Of course, they never succeeded in creating the kind of academic communities that existed on Western campuses, and those still elude us, except some at postgraduate level. Curzon's reforms did also give a significant impetus to the primary sector. He correctly identified that money was the main hurdle here, and he sanctioned liberal new government grants for primary schools. As a result, the number of recognized primary schools increased by 25,000 within a decade. Curzon also tried to reduce traditionalism in primary education by introducing subjects like agriculture and physical education into the curriculum. But despite such efforts, primary education barely kept pace with India's growing population, and the Raj conspicuously failed in Curzon's aim to educate the Indian masses. Curzon's only consolation might have been the even more abysmal performance of post-independence Indian governments, which failed to introduce free and compulsory primary education until more than 60 years later, in 2009, and even then of a very patchy sort. The educationist Anil Sadgopal said of the hurriedly drafted Act of 2009, quote, "It is a fraud on our children. It gives neither free education nor compulsory education. In fact, it only legitimizes the present multi-layered inferior quality school education system where discrimination shall continue to prevail." Returning to the Raj, who was right about its education record, Gandhi or Philip Hartog? I think I've said enough to demonstrate that far from digging up the roots of indigenous education, as Gandhi claimed, the Raj at worst treated them with benign neglect. There's certainly no evidence of village schools being shut down. Most were funded by the charity of local temples, mosques, and zamindars, and they carried on under the Raj as before, though with all the shortcomings I mentioned earlier. Now, I'd like to end with some education statistics during the Raj, from which you can draw your own conclusions. I hope they might be visible on this slide. It's a bit small. Sorry, I'm not very good at expanding things for PowerPoints, and that's the best a very helpful friend of mine could do. So, but I'll verbalize the statistics. Now, what it showed was male literacy, which was defined as the ability to read and write age 7 or above, actually trebled during the period from 1900 to 1947, rising from 9% to 27%. Female literacy during the same period increased far more dramatically, jumping from a virtually non-existent 0.5% to almost 9%. Now, admittedly, these were low figures for both sexes, but they were still a significant improvement on a low baseline. So there's no evidence of decline. The evidence is of slow but steady improvement. At independence, enrollment in primary schools in the age group 6 to 11 years was 43%, which is not really that bad. But the dropout rate was very high. So in the 11 to 14-year age group, enrollment had dropped to only 13% from 43%. The enrollment ratio at high school level was a mere 5.3%. In colleges and universities, the enrollment ratio was a tiny 0.33%. Another alarming figure at independence was that 45% of school teachers, that's almost half, were untrained. Coming on to the number of schools and colleges in 1947, there were 210,000 primary schools, an average of 1 to every 5 square miles, and there were 21,000 middle and secondary schools. Finally, there were 27 universities and 498 colleges, with a total enrollment of about 1 million students. Now, since independence, higher education has expanded by leaps and bounds. I'm sorry, you can't see the figures there. I'm also finding it difficult to read them. But the number of universities has increased 18-fold, the number of colleges 35 times, enrollment more than 10-fold to about 10 million today. How much these numbers tell us is another matter. Whether or not we have sacrificed quality for quantity, you are better judges than I. Certainly, Lord Curzon would not have approved of this enormous university expansion if he didn't approve of the very modest expansion of the late 19th century. Elphinstone College, where Whabiz Merchant and I studied, used to be the jewel in the crown of Bombay University. Today, I'm sorry to say, it's the pits. Whereas Ho Shang's alma mater, St. Xavier's, which is still run by the Jesuits, now leads the way. So I wonder what that tells us. I'll stop there and open it up to questions and for. Thank you.
Zareer, I have no question.
Yeah.
But I just have a comment. Lord Curzon should be given the credit actually for being the first to want to universalize primary education in India. He wanted to universalize it.
Yes.
But his colleagues suggested that he be more cautious because if the so-called natives become educated, then they will overthrow us.
Well, as I said, that was the view well before Curzon, even in the early 19th century, that education might lead to opposition to British rule, which was not the policy that the British government here followed. They did encourage education. I think in Curzon's case, implementation also depended on lack of funds. And, it's a huge project introducing compulsory free primary education in India, which the post-independence government didn't do till 2009, and still arguably, some people would say it's still not happened. Sorry, is that Darryl? No.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. Yeah.
My question is, sir, would you comment on Hardy and Ramanujan's relationship? Because Hardy considered Ramanujan a great scientist, and Ramanujan, got a leg up in life because of Hardy.
So you're talking about Thomas Hardy?
No.
The mathematician.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of, I'm absolutely hopeless in anything to do, Curzon would have despaired of anything to do with other than liberal arts. I know nothing about mathematics. I just about know about the existence of Ramanujan, but I do not know about the encouragement he got. Yeah. At the back, yes. Go ahead.
Is it correct that after the mutiny, accepting the fact that the viceroys were here on shorter periods than people like Hastings were, they the powers that ruled were much less interested in learning for themselves Indian languages and about India.
After the mutiny. Well, I think that changed really before the mutiny. But I think certainly after the mutiny there was a kind of more Anglicist, kind of revulsion against things Indian. However, I think that changed by the sort of post-World War I period when, and let's not forget that every ICS officer, British or Indian, had to learn 2 Indian languages before they came to India. So that was a requirement, that, I know you had to know either Hindi and Marathi or Hindi and another regional language. That was a requirement, and many of them carried on, not immediately after the mutiny, but certainly in the first half of the 20th century, studying all sorts of local customs, some of the best studies of tribals in India, of Dalits in India, have been written by amateur, anthropologists and sociologists who were just collectors, district officers, kind of touring their districts and making notes and then writing them up as they did in the early 19th century. Yes.
You mentioned on more than one occasion lack of funds inhibiting the fulfillment of certain policies. The general impression that the layman has is that funds by the barrel load were exiting India and going to the UK. So where was the lack of funds?
I'm afraid that is a complete fallacy. No barrel loads went to the UK. What the so-called drain theory, which most modern economists now reject, it was Dadabhai Naoroji's theory, which was that because Indian revenues paid for the salaries of British officials and military officers, etc., who remitted those remittances back to the UK, that was draining wealth from India. However, what wasn't reckoned in the balance sheet was the fact that a lot of them spent a lot of their income here. They didn't just remit it back. So that was coming into the Indian economy, creating jobs, creating local manufacturers, etc., which were being bought. Secondly, the entire civil and military administration here spent a large budget in India. So the idea that Indian revenues were going entirely one way isn't correct. And then you have to balance that against all the investment that came in. Now, I don't have the relevant figures with me here, but I can certainly present you with figures which show that the net investment, British investment in India over the 19th and 20th centuries far outweighed the revenues that were sent back. Well, I don't have those figures with me here.
I would just like to point out that your person also made a speech on the 5th of November 1900 to the Raj Kumar College, where he very much stressed the importance of high standards of education, but at the same time maintaining their Eastern quality. And this speech, might be of amusement to the audience, was reproduced by His Highness the Maharaja of Brahmapura and given to the principal of Raj Kumar College in 1980.
Absolutely. The late Maharaja of Rangazar was a very good personal friend and a great sort of, very learned, scholarly anthropologist. Do you want to just read a short extract from it?
I think you should, sir.
Oh, I think I've read enough of Curzon. Why don't you give us your highlights?
In this college, we're to emancipate its students from old-fashioned prejudice and superstitions at the cost of denationalisation. I, for one, should think the price too heavy. The Anglicized Indian is no more attractive spectacle in my eye than the Indianized Englishman. Both are hybrids of an unnatural type. There we want young chiefs who are educated here to learn the English language, become sufficiently familiar with English customs, literature, science, modes of thought, standards, truth, and honour. And I may add with manly English sports and games, to be able to hold their own in the world in which their lot will be cast, without appearing to be dullards or proud. If they subsequently become rulers, the benefit of enlightenment and pure administration. Beyond that, we do not trust them to go. After all, those Kumars who become chiefs are called upon to rule not an English but an Indian people, and as a prince who is to have any influence and justify its existence must be one with his own subjects. It is clear that it is not by English models alone, but by an adaptation of Eastern prescriptions to the Western standard that he can hope to succeed.
Yeah, I think we, some people didn't hear it too well, but I think we got the drift of it. Yeah, I mean, he was opposing Anglicization and advocating a sort of fusion of Eastern knowledge with Western education. Yeah. Bachi.
Presented a very strong case for what the British did in India for education. But I think that there is a great failure of that, because what we are seeing today is very much the kind of situation that the British decried about India. I mean, the kind of descriptions that were given about half-naked children sitting under a tree for primary education still persist. We still have a very heavy emphasis on higher education, which is absurd when you don't have it in primary education, and the same applies in the health system as well. The fact that women's education is still neglected, and the fact that Indians themselves are today decrying the anglicized Indian. So obviously the British, for all their years of trying to change, were very successful in doing it.
Bachi, I would argue that, yes, I agree with everything you've said, and I, alluded to that as well, but I don't think we can blame the British for the last 70 years. It's 70 years is a long time. Sorry? Yes. Okay. But, I think where you have a point is that the British laid certain foundations which, rightly or wrongly, the modern Indian state carried on after independence. As you say, the emphasis on higher education, which did go back to Macaulay. But, as I say, the second half of Macaulay was about taking it to the masses. So the British didn't do it because they, didn't put the necessary funds into it. Laissez-faire governments, Britain did not have free and compulsory education until well into the 20th century or the late 19th century. So governments were not meant to spend huge amounts in those days on education, social services of any kind. It was left to the private sector. I mean, in Britain, it was faith schools that actually brought literacy to most of the population. So I think in India there was this problem, which was that the voluntary sector was not able to come and fill the gap in the primary sector. And the emphasis on higher education did, I think Lord Mayo's kind of scathing attack on Babus, is very relevant today, because there is this idea that you churn out sort of university graduates who then get clerical jobs and are not equipped for anything else. And that is at the expense of going down the primary route. But I'm not sure how one rebalances that within, a democracy which does sort of value higher education. I mean, the IIT certainly came during the post-independence period, although again, I didn't have time to mention, Curzon had set up technical colleges which later were copied. Very difficult to say in a country like India. Of course, now China has achieved the kind of progress that you would like to see. But I mean, how you achieve that without a kind of very authoritarian dictatorship, I'm not sure. I mean, the British certainly didn't run a very authoritarian dictatorship, and, we mercifully in some respects don't have one now. So I think in India it probably is a very slow process. And whether this filtration works, I think is a big question, because, 2009 primary education in India was statutory. But I believe it's very partial. Now, there is someone here, is it Astad? who has done quite a lot of work in Maharashtra with primary schools, and tells me there is a huge amount of progress in Maharashtra in terms of actually making primary education free and compulsory to everyone. There are problems still to do with getting the right technology into the schools. You know, electricity failures mean you can't run a constant internet, you can't use computers and DVDs to the extent you ought to be able to. I imagine these things will change, and in some states they are changing. I mean, again, I think, India is a huge patchwork that way. I think Maharashtra is probably far ahead of the UP and Bihar. But I'm not an expert on contemporary education. I don't know, Astad, if you would like to say something about that.
Okay, one thing I would like to say, and that is that in Maharashtra, that's the only area that I know, the language has become a source of confusion in teaching. The parents feel that they are thinking that duty if they don't send their child to an English medium school. Now, if you live in a global party where nobody in the family, nobody around you speaks English, and you are then sent to an English medium school, you have a terrible setback for the child and a high dropout rate because the child loses confidence in themselves. The correct way to do it is to let the child in the primary education learn in the mother tongue and side by side teach English of a decent standard. That is what we are trying to do. And I think that that does work. At least to a large extent we have found that it is successful. It's still not adopted however, but in time to come hopefully it will get more and more adopted.
Certainly, it sounds very encouraging, and certainly Lord Curzon would have thoroughly agreed with you. That's the way to go about it. English should be taught, but it should be an adjunct to education in the mother tongue at the primary level, and then you go make English the medium at the high school level. Sorry, the a bit too, yeah.
We are at the moment in a situation where we think of primary education really is literacy. But if you consider all school education primary education, and we're rewriting history, we are fiddling with the basic tenets of science and so on, are we so sure that we're doing the right thing for our primary education? We have to be who are literate, but they know all the wrong things.
Well, hopefully literacy leads to higher education, secondary education, where you do bring in all those other wider subjects. I suppose it depends what you expect from primary education. I mean, I'm not an expert on primary education per se, but I would have thought language, literacy and numeracy are the key things that you expect to come out of it, which you can then build on at secondary level. But I think the problem with Indian primary education also, if you certainly consider rural areas, is a very high dropout rate, which was so, in Curzon's time. And that basically, agricultural laborers or kisans want to withdraw their children at quite an early age to go and work in the fields or go and find jobs in the cities. So that, again, is a problem related to the wider economic system.
In my mind, primary education is the foundation of education. And so if the primary education is not right, the rest of the education is always very shaky. It's like building a building with a wrong foundation. So the first 5 years are, to my mind, critical for the growth of the child.
Yeah. No, I think just, to hark back to Bachi's point, I think my sort of overall conclusion would be that the British didn't do a great job for Indian education. I don't think they damaged it in the way that, Gandhi suggested by digging up the tree. I don't think there was much of an educational infrastructure when they arrived. I think whatever they did was, in the long run, some kind of improvement, but it was a drop in the ocean. So my conclusion would be they made some slow, steady improvements, but nothing major, which is probably true of post-independence governments as well. possibly because they're following the same sort of template. Yeah.
How do you think the government should go ahead with education?
Now, as someone just said, I'm a historian, so I can't give you a prescription. Personal view, I would certainly firstly put a lot more into the voluntary sector. So I would like to see, instead of government schools, government funding good voluntary schools, giving them grants to encourage them, and that way a partnership, private-public partnerships, which, the little I know, there are organizations like Muktangan, which do something similar in Bombay. I'm sure, there are other examples all over the country. So I think that sort of, extending that across, and I think much more voluntary input, maybe parents getting together and setting up schools. But of course, that already presupposes a level of education to do that. So some of it is chicken egg, but I certainly would agree with all the people who've said future resources ought to go into the primary sector, much less into higher education. I think certainly, the plethora of degrees in BComs and all sorts of things that, are neither achieving anything significant in the field of arts, and certainly not leading people into more creative jobs or creating more employment, I think it's, I don't want to sound patronizing, but it is the old sort of Babu mentality that has somehow persisted. I don't think that we can blame that entirely on the British. I think the Babu mentality predated the British, and it was this idea that, you acquired educational qualifications to set yourself above other people and got jobs in government, and then you stayed there, and that was it. I'm going to end now, I think, with thanks again to the NCPA. Thanks again to Hoshang Merchant, and most of all to Whabiz Merchant, who was a wonderful person. I didn't have time to say very much about her, but she was a remarkable person, courageous, great student, great mind, fought this terrible illness which took her so early, with total courage, no self-pity, always cheerful. So, very happy to be asked to honor her, and I feel honored to have done it. Thank you, Hoshang.